A mysterious boy appears with a flute in his hands and changes everything inside a hospital where hope had already fallen silent. What seemed impossible begins to happen, and no one can explain it. The constant beeping of the machines echoed like an implacable clock in room 307 of St. Clair Hospital in Charleston. Edward Mitchell Anderson, 42 years old, a respected businessman in the real estate sector of the South Carolina capital, watched his daughter with eyes that no longer knew rest. Lily, only 7 years old, remained motionless in the hospital bed, as if she had been frozen in time. The girl's brown hair, once always tied in colorful braids, now lay spread across the white pillow, forming a contrast that tore at her father's heart. 15 days had passed since the accident on Highway 17. 15 days since a speeding truck had struck the car where Cecilia was driving with Lily in the back seat. 15 days since Edward received the call that changed his life forever. Cecilia didn't survive. Lily survived, but plunged into a deep sleep from which the doctors couldn't guarantee a return. "Dad, can't we go faster? I want to show my drawing to the teacher before class," were the last words he heard from his daughter that morning before kissing her forehead and saying he'd return later for dinner. He never imagined that would be the last time he'd hear her voice. Edward adjusted himself in the uncomfortable armchair that had become his only place of rest. The deep, dark circles told the story of poorly slept nights. The impeccable suit, the businessman's trademark, had been replaced by sweatpants and wrinkled T-shirts. The unshaven beard completed the portrait of a man in suspension. "Mr. Anderson, you need to go home and rest a bit," said Rebecca, the head nurse, a middle-aged woman with a gentle smile and eyes that had witnessed too much suffering. "Staying here 24 hours a day won't help Lily. We need you to be strong when she wakes up." "When, not if, Rebecca." "When she wakes up," Edward corrected, without taking his eyes off his daughter. "And I can't leave her alone. She's afraid of hospitals. She always has been. If she wakes up and doesn't see me here..." Rebecca sighed, already knowing that conversation well. In 2 weeks, the businessman had refused to leave the hospital for more than a few hours. He slept in the armchair, ate poorly, spoke little. The hospital staff already knew his routine. He arrived early, sat beside his daughter, read stories, talked about the day, about Cecilia, about plans for when they returned home. "Today's tests showed no significant change," continued Rebecca, consulting the chart. "But the vital signs continue stable. That's positive." Edward nodded mechanically. Stable. The word that at first brought some comfort now sounded like a sentence. Stable meant nothing was getting worse, but also that nothing was getting better. Time was his greatest enemy now. "Dr. Carter will come see her this afternoon. Maybe he'll have news about that experimental treatment we discussed," added the nurse before leaving Edward alone again with his daughter and the thoughts that tormented him. Guilt was a constant presence. If he had been driving that day, if he had cancelled that meeting, if he had answered Cecilia's call minutes before the accident, the alternative possibilities haunted him like ghosts. The afternoon advanced slowly. Through the window, Edward observed the dark clouds forming over Charleston Harbor. The South Carolina summer was particularly humid that year, with almost daily storms that transformed Charleston's sky into a canvas of gray and violet tones. It was when the first thunder announced the imminent storm that the room door opened. Edward expected to see Nurse Rebecca, or perhaps Dr. Carter, but who appeared in the doorway left him momentarily speechless. A boy, appearing no more than 10 years old, stood still, observing the interior of the room with a serenity that contrasted with his appearance. He was barefoot, wearing a T-shirt too worn for the cold weather and faded shorts. His black, messy hair framed a thin face with deep, expressive eyes. But what most caught Edward's attention was the object the boy carried in his hands, a small, wooden flute darkened by time and use. "Are you lost, kid?" Edward asked, recovering from his initial surprise. "This isn't a place for children to play." The boy didn't respond. His eyes jumped from Edward to Lily, lingering on the girl with disturbing intensity. Without asking permission, he entered the room, his bare feet making a light sound against the cold floor. "Hey, wait!" Edward stood up, positioning himself between the strange visitor and his daughter's bed. "Who are you? How did you get in?" "Here?" The silence persisted. The boy simply went around Edward like water around a stone and sat in a chair in the corner of the room. He sat as if that place also belonged to him, as if he were there every day. Edward was about to call security when something stopped him. There was something in that boy's gaze, something familiar and at the same time mysterious that made him hesitate. The kid didn't seem threatening, just different. "Do you know my daughter?" Edward tried again, sitting on the edge of the armchair, keeping his eyes fixed on the unexpected visitor. The boy finally spoke, his voice surprisingly clear for someone so small. "She likes music." 3 words that fell like stones in the lake of Edward's consciousness. Yes, Lily loved music. Cecilia had started her on piano at 5 years old, and the girl showed a natural talent that filled her parents with pride. How could that strange boy know this? "Who told you that?" "Who are you?" Edward insisted, suspicion mixing with curiosity. The boy lifted the flute, examining it as if looking for imperfections on its worn surface. "Can I play for her?" The question caught Edward off guard. His rational mind told him to expel this intruder, call security, demand explanations. But something deeper, more instinctive, made him hesitate. "Do you know how to play that?" In response, the boy brought the flute to his lips. Edward was about to stop him, worried about the noise and hospital rules, when the first sounds filled the environment. It wasn't a common melody, one of those learned in music schools. It was something more primitive, more visceral, as if each note was drawn not from the instrument, but from some deep and ancestral place. Edward felt a shiver run down his spine. The music was simultaneously sad and hopeful, a sonic contradiction that seemed to speak directly to the most basic emotions. Without realizing it, he closed his eyes, letting himself be carried away by that strange and enveloping melody. When the last note dissipated in the air, Edward opened his eyes, almost expecting everything to be nothing more than a hallucination caused by exhaustion. But the boy was still there, now looking fixedly at Lily. "She's listening," said the kid, with the same certainty with which someone would affirm that the sky is blue. Edward turned to his daughter, not understanding. Lily continued motionless, apparently oblivious to everything happening around her. The monitors continued with their constant beeping, without alteration. "How did you get in here?" Edward asked, returning to his defensive posture. "Children can't wander alone in the hospital." The boy stood up, putting the flute in his back pocket. "Tomorrow I'll return," he said simply, heading toward the door. "Wait, what's your name? Who are your parents?" Edward tried to reach him, but the boy had already left for the corridor. When Edward reached the door, the corridor was empty, as if the strange visitor had vanished into thin air. Confused, he approached the nurse's station. "Did you see a boy pass by here, barefoot, with a flute?" The nurses exchanged confused looks. "No child passed by here, Mr. Anderson," replied one of them. "Children can only enter accompanied by adults, and only during visiting hours." Edward returned to the room, intrigued and disturbed. Was he imagining things? Could exhaustion and stress be affecting his perception of reality? But the memory of the music was too vivid, too real. He sat again beside Lily, observing her pale and serene face. It was then he noticed something that made him hold his breath. A single tear was flowing from the corner of the girl's right eye. Edward called the nurse, who confirmed what he had seen, although she tried to minimize it. "Involuntary? Reflexes are common in coma patients, Mr. Anderson. It doesn't necessarily mean she's conscious." But Edward knew. Something had changed in that room, something related to that strange music, to that mysterious boy. For the first time in 15 days, he felt a spark of hope ignite in his chest. Outside, the storm finally broke over Charleston, washing the streets and purifying the air. Edward looked through the window, observing the lightning that momentarily illuminated the harbor. Somewhere out there, a boy with a flute walked in the rain, carrying with him a mystery that Edward was determined to unravel. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Tell us what city you're watching from, let's continue. The next morning dawned with clear skies, as if the previous night's storm had taken away all the clouds. Edward woke startled. In the armchair, his neck aching from the uncomfortable position. For a moment he was disoriented, until the familiar beeping of the machines brought him back to reality. 15 days, and he was already getting used to that sound that marked the border between life and uncertainty. His first look was at Lily. As always, she remained motionless, but Edward couldn't stop thinking about the tear he had seen the day before. Had it been just an involuntary reflex, as the nurse suggested, or was it a sign that his daughter somehow was present, listening, feeling? "Good morning, Princess," he said, leaning to kiss his daughter's forehead. "Daddy's here, always will be." The hospital routine soon established itself around them. Nurses came in to check vital signs, change the IV, administer medications. Dr. Carter, the neurologist responsible for the case, made his morning visit, carefully examining the data and performing response tests. "Any news, Doctor?" Edward asked, as he did every day. The doctor, a middle-aged man with graying hair and thin-framed glasses, hesitated before responding. "The tests continue showing stable brain activity. There's been no deterioration, which is positive, but we also don't see clear signs of significant improvement." Edward felt the familiar weight of those words. Neither better nor worse. Stagnant. In a medical limbo that seemed to have no end. "What about that experimental treatment we mentioned?" Edward insisted. "We're evaluating the possibility," the doctor replied, cautious. "But I need to be frank, Mr. Anderson. The risks are considerable, and the success rate is still low. We need to weigh carefully before going down that path." When the doctor left, Edward felt frustration grow within him. He had used all his contacts, offered to pay any amount, but medicine seemed to have reached its limit. He felt powerless, a feeling that Edward Anderson, accustomed to solving problems with money and influence, rarely experienced. Near midday, when the sun was already high in Charleston's sky, Edward noticed movement at the door. His heart accelerated as he recognized the small figure silently entering the room. The boy with the flute had returned, exactly as he had promised. This time, Edward was prepared. "You came back," he said, carefully observing the kid. In daylight, he could see the details better: the bare and dirty feet, the worn clothes, the thin face that seemed to carry more experience than his age suggested. The boy nodded, heading directly to the same chair he had occupied the day before. Without asking permission, he sat down and took the flute from his pocket. "Wait," Edward raised his hand. "Before you begin, I want to know who you are. How do you know my daughter? Why are you here?" The kid looked at Edward with eyes that seemed much older than his body. "My name is David," he replied simply, "and I'm here to help Lily find her. Way back." The enigmatic answer only increased Edward's uneasiness. "How do you know my daughter? Did you study together?" David looked away, fixing it on Lily. "Mrs. Cecilia taught me to play," he said, his low voice almost lost in the hospital's ambient sound. Edward felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath his feet. Cecilia? The boy knew his wife? How was that possible? Cecilia had never mentioned anything about giving music lessons to children. "You knew my wife?" he asked, his voice trembling. "She went to the shelter every Thursday," David replied naturally. "She brought sweets and taught music. She said music can heal what medicine can't reach." Edward sat down slowly, trying to process that information. Cecilia dedicated a lot of time to volunteer work, he knew that. But she had never gone into details, and Edward, always busy with his enterprises, had never asked much. Now this unknown part of his wife's life appeared before him in the form of that strange boy. "What shelter is that?" Edward asked, trying to organize his thoughts. "New Dawn Institute in North Charleston," David replied, already preparing the flute. "Can I play now? She's waiting." Edward wanted to ask more questions, understand better this unexpected connection, but something in David's gaze stopped him. There was an urgency there, a certainty that seemed to transcend any rational explanation. "Yes, you can play," he conceded, leaning back in the armchair, observing the boy with new perspective. David brought the flute to his lips and began to play. The melody was different from the day before, but equally hypnotizing. The notes flowed like water, filling the room with an almost palpable presence. Edward closed his eyes, letting himself be enveloped by the music. It was strangely familiar, as if he had heard it at some distant moment. It was when he realized it was a lullaby that Cecilia used to sing to Lily when she was a baby. Her simple melody, which his wife said she had learned from her grandmother. How could that boy know it? While the music continued, Edward carefully observed his daughter, looking for any sign of reaction. It was when he noticed the fingers of Lily's right hand were moving slightly, as if following the melody's rhythm. "My God," Edward murmured, jumping up. "Nurse, nurse!" Rebecca ran into the room, alarmed by the call. "What happened, Mr. Anderson?" "Her fingers, and she's moving her fingers," Edward pointed, his voice trembling with emotion. The nurse approached, observing carefully. "Yes, there's a slight movement," she confirmed, surprised. "I'll call Dr. Carter immediately." When he turned to thank David, Edward realized the boy had disappeared again. The chair was empty, as if he had never been there. The rest of the day was a whirlwind. Dr. Carter performed a battery of new tests, confirming that there was an increase in Lily's brain activity. It wasn't a dramatic change, but it was significant enough for the doctor, usually so cautious, to allow a slight optimism. "It's a positive sign," he explained. "It indicates there may be a response to the environment. I don't want to create false hopes, but it's definitely a development we want to monitor closely." That night, Edward couldn't sleep. His mind was full of unanswered questions. Who was that boy really? How did he know Cecilia? And, most importantly, how did his music seem to be affecting Lily in a way that medicine couldn't explain? He decided he needed to investigate. For the first time since the accident, Edward left the hospital early the next morning, promising Lily he'd return soon. He drove his Mercedes along Highway 17, then headed toward North Charleston, to a more distant and simple area of the city. The New Dawn Institute was an old, poorly maintained building, painted a faded yellow that had seen better days. A small courtyard surrounded by rusty bars served as a recreation area for children, who played under the supervision of few adults. Edward parked in front and watched for a few minutes. The contrast with his reality was striking. Accustomed to frequenting Charleston's most exclusive environments, he now found himself in front of a place that represented a part of the city he preferred to ignore. Gathering courage, he crossed the main gate and headed to the reception. A middle-aged woman with hair pulled back in a severe bun received him with suspicion. "Good morning. How can I help you?" she asked, examining the well-dressed visitor from head to toe. "Good morning. My name is Edward Anderson. I'm looking for information about a boy named David who lives here, and I'd also like to know about volunteer work that my wife Cecilia Anderson performed at this institution." The woman's expression changed upon hearing Cecilia's name. "Mrs. Cecilia, such a sad loss. We learned about the accident from the newspapers. The children missed her greatly, especially the Thursday music classes." Edward felt a knot in his throat. So it was true then. Cecilia really frequented that place, dedicated her time to those children, and he had never cared to know details. "As for David," the woman continued, lowering her voice, "he's a special case. He arrived here 3 years ago after losing his parents in tragic circumstances. He rarely speaks, doesn't socialize with the other children. The only thing that seemed to interest him were Mrs. Cecilia's music classes. He has a flute," Edward commented. "He plays very well." The woman nodded. "It was a gift from your wife. She noticed he had a natural talent and brought the instrument especially for him. It was the only time we saw him smile when he played that flute. He's been visiting my daughter at the hospital," Edward revealed, "playing for her." The woman seemed genuinely surprised. "David left the institute? That's impossible. The children can't leave without authorization, and he doesn't even have family who could pick him up." Nevertheless, he was there. "Twice already," Edward insisted, "and his music seems to have some effect on my daughter." The woman seemed uncomfortable with that information. "Mr. Anderson, we have strict rules here. If David was at the hospital, it was without our knowledge or permission. This is something we'll need to investigate internally. Edward decided to change his approach. Can I speak with him? Is he here today? I'm afraid that's not possible right now. The children are in educational activities until noon. Besides, we would need official authorization for any interaction with our wards. Edward realized he wouldn't get more information there. He thanked her and left his card, asking them to contact him if there was any news about David. Upon leaving the institute, he stopped at the gate and looked back. In the courtyard, the children continued playing, oblivious to his presence. But at a second-floor window, Edward saw a familiar face watching him. David was there, motionless, holding his flute, his eyes fixed on Edward as if trying to communicate something without words. Edward raised his hand in a greeting gesture. The boy didn't respond, just continued watching until an adult figure appeared behind him and abruptly closed the curtain. While driving back to the hospital, Edward couldn't stop thinking about what he had discovered. Cecilia had a parallel life dedicated to helping underprivileged children, about which he knew very little. And somehow that connection now manifested through that mysterious boy and his music that seemed to awaken Lily from her deep sleep. Upon arriving at the hospital, he found Dr. Carter waiting for him with an expression that mixed surprise and incomprehension. "Mr. Anderson, something extraordinary happened while you were away," said the doctor, quickly leading him to Lily's room. "The electroencephalogram showed activity spikes we can't explain. It's as if her brain was reacting to something, or someone." Edward felt a shiver run down his spine. He was here again, wasn't he? The boy with the flute. Dr. Carter frowned, confused. "Boy. No, Mr. Anderson. No visits were registered this morning. Your daughter was alone when the machines began showing the alterations." Alone. The word echoed in Edward's mind as he entered the room and found Lily exactly as he had. Left her, but there was something different now. A sensation in the air, like a subtle perfume that remains even after its bearer has gone. And on the nightstand, where Edward was certain there had been nothing when he left, was a single field flower, yellow and delicate, exactly like the ones Cecilia used to pick in the fields during their weekend walks with Lily. The calendar hanging on the hospital room wall marked that 3 weeks had already passed since the accident. 3 weeks in which Edward's life had been reduced to those 4 white walls and the constant sound of machines. But now, for the first time, there was a spark of real hope. Lily's finger movements, initially subtle, became more frequent. Sometimes her eyelids trembled slightly, as if she were dreaming. Dr. Carter, always cautious, began to speak of promising signs of gradual recovery, words that Edward repeated to himself like a mantra. David's visits became part of the routine. Every day around noon the boy appeared silently, sat in the same chair and played his flute for about 20 minutes. Edward had given up questioning how he managed to enter the hospital without being noticed. Some mysteries, he had concluded, didn't need to be explained, just accepted. What most intrigued Edward was that no one else besides him seemed to see the boy. Nurses entered and left the room during the music sessions, never mentioning or interacting with David. It was as if he were invisible to everyone, except for Edward and apparently for Lily, who responded to the music with small movements increasingly evident. "It's as if the music were rebuilding the connections in her brain," commented Dr. Carter during a visit, unaware of the true source of that improvement. "I've read studies about music therapy in coma patients, but we rarely see results this clear." Edward just agreed, keeping to himself the secret of those mysterious visits. Part of him feared that, if he shared the truth, the magic, and he found no other word to describe what was happening, might break. That afternoon, after another music session, Edward decided to follow David. He waited for the boy to leave the room and, maintaining a safe distance, followed him through the hospital corridors. Surprisingly, no one seemed to notice the barefoot kid with his wooden flute, as if he were completely invisible. David crossed the main lobby and went out to the sunny street. Edward followed him to a bus stop, where the boy boarded a bus headed to North Charleston. Quickly, Edward got his car from the parking lot and followed the bus, always keeping it in sight. 20 minutes later, David got off at a stop near James Island, a more remote and simple area of Charleston. Edward parked and continued following him on foot, watching the boy walk naturally through dirt roads and narrow alleys, occasionally greeting local residents who, to Edward's surprise, seemed to see him normally. Finally, David stopped in front of a small, simple house painted light blue with a small garden in front where some flowers bravely resisted the summer heat. The boy opened the wooden gate and entered, disappearing into the interior of the residence. Edward remained standing at the corner, uncertain about what to do. That didn't make sense. If David lived there, why had the Institute employee said he was a resident without family? Determined to get answers, Edward crossed the street and knocked on the blue house's door. An elderly lady answered, her face marked by time but with lively and alert eyes. "Can I help you, young man?" she asked, examining the well-dressed visitor. With curiosity. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Excuse me for bothering you, but I'm looking for a boy named David. I just saw him entering this house." The lady's expression changed, a mixture of confusion and sadness taking over her countenance. "Oh, my child, David was my grandson, but he's no longer with us. He passed away almost 2 years ago." Edward felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. "What do you mean? I saw him entering here just now, a boy, about 10 years old, with a wooden flute." The lady brought her hand to her chest. "The flute? You saw the flute?" Her voice trembled. "Please, come in. We need to talk." Edward followed the lady into the simple but impeccably clean house. In the small living room, the walls were covered with photographs. And there in a central frame was David, smiling, holding his flute. "This is my grandson," said the lady, Mrs. Sullivan, as she introduced herself. "David was always special. He had a gift for music that no one could explain. He played by ear, any instrument, but the flute was his favorite." Edward looked at the photo, unable to process what he was hearing. It was undeniably the same boy who visited Lily every day. "What happened to him?" he finally asked, his voice almost a whisper. Mrs. Sullivan sat heavily in a worn armchair. "A fever. Came from nowhere. Took him in 3 days. The doctors couldn't." "Explain it." "After he passed, I didn't have the strength to keep his things. I donated almost everything to the shelter where he used to go on Thursdays for music classes with a very good lady. Cecilia, I think her name was." Edward's world seemed to be spinning. David had passed away. The boy who played for his daughter every day couldn't exist, yet he had seen him, heard his music, witnessed the effects on Lily. "The flute," said Edward, trying to maintain his composure. "What happened to it?" "Buried with him," replied Mrs. Sullivan, tears in her eyes. "It was his wish. He always said that flute had magic, that it came from a special place. Teacher Cecilia had given it to him. She said it was very old, passed down through generations in her family." Edward felt his legs weaken. Cecilia had never mentioned a family flute. However, the coincidences were impossible to ignore. "I need to go," Edward said, standing up abruptly. "Thank you for your time, Mrs. Sullivan." "Wait," the lady stopped. "Him. If you saw my grandson, if you saw David with his flute, that means something. He always said music can cross all worlds, reach whoever needs to be reached. If he appeared to you, it's because someone needs that music." Edward left the house with his mind in turmoil. He drove almost automatically back to the hospital, questioning his own sanity. Was he hallucinating due to stress and exhaustion? But how to explain Lily's improvements, perfectly synchronized with the visits and music of a boy who, apparently, no longer existed? Upon arriving at the hospital, instead of going directly to Lily's room, Edward headed to the underground parking garage. In his trunk, there was a cardboard box containing some of Cecilia's personal belongings that he had rescued from the crashed car. He had never had the courage to open it. Sitting in his car, Edward finally removed the tape that sealed the box. Inside, he found his wife's purse, some books, a notebook, and a worn leather case. He opened the notebook first, immediately recognizing Cecilia's elegant handwriting. The initial pages contained notes about her private piano students, appointments, and shopping lists. But, advancing through the notebook, Edward found detailed records about the classes at the shelter. Children's names, observations about their progress, small victories celebrated with enthusiasm. And then, several pages dedicated exclusively to David. David showed extraordinary talent today. The way he intuits melodies is almost supernatural. It's as if the music was already inside him, just waiting to come out. I gave Grandma's flute to David today. I know Mum would be horrified that I gave a family heirloom to a shelter boy, but his connection with the instrument was immediate. It's as if the flute had chosen him. David told me about his dream today. He said music can awaken people who are sleeping a special sleep. Strange coincidence considering the story Grandma used to tell about how the flute saved her brother. Edward continued reading, absorbing each word like a thirsty man. The notes ended abruptly a few weeks before the accident, with a phrase that made his heart tighten. One day, this song will heal. With trembling hands, Edward opened the leather case. Inside, there were several sheet music pieces, yellowed by time, some looking extremely old. Most were handwritten in a notation system he didn't completely recognize. In one of them, a title in Old English, The Awakening Song. And, on the back of the sheet music, a note in handwriting that wasn't Cecilia's. For those lost between worlds, may music be the bridge to return. Edward put everything back in the box except the notebook and sheet music, which he took with him to Lily's room. He sat in the familiar armchair, observing his daughter while trying to process everything he had discovered. It was early evening when the door opened. Edward expected to see Rebecca or another nurse, but who entered was a man he had never seen before. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing simple but well-cared-for clothes, he carried an air of authority that immediately put Edward on alert. "Mr. Anderson?" The man extended his hand. "My name is Albert Foster. I'm the administrative director of the New Dawn Institute. I heard you were there today asking questions about one of our residents." Edward shook the offered hand, noting the excessive strength in the grip. "Yes, I was. I'm trying to understand the connection between a boy named David, my wife Cecilia, and my daughter Lily." Albert smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "It's precisely about this that I came to talk. There's been a misunderstanding. The David you asked about is no longer a resident of our shelter. He was transferred to another institution a few months ago." "Transferred?" Edward narrowed his eyes. "Your employee didn't mention anything about a transfer this morning." "She's new, probably wasn't aware of the situation," Albert replied quickly. "The important thing is that if a boy has been visiting your daughter claiming to be David from our institute, it's an imposter. And that concerns me greatly, Mr. Anderson. The safety of the children is our priority." Edward felt something cold settle in his stomach. There was something deeply false in the concern shown by Albert. "Curious," Edward commented, maintaining a casual tone, "because today I spoke with David's grandmother, Mrs. Sullivan. She told me her grandson passed away almost 2 years ago." Albert's expression hardened momentarily, before returning to the mask of concern. "That's disturbing. Perhaps we're talking about different children. The David we knew at the shelter is certainly alive, just no longer with us." "And where was he transferred to?" Edward pressed. "Unfortunately, I can't share that information without judicial authorization," Albert evaded. "Privacy protocols, you understand?" Before Edward could respond, the door opened again and Rebecca entered. "Sorry to interrupt, Mr. Anderson, but it's time for Lily's bath." Albert stood up promptly. "I won't take up any more of your time. I just wanted to alert you about this confusing situation. If you need any additional clarification, here's my card." He handed a business card to Edward and left the room with a last look at Lily that made Edward feel a shiver down his spine. "Who was that man?" Rebecca asked after Albert left. "Says he's the director of a children's shelter," Edward replied, examining the card, "but something tells me he's lying." Rebecca seemed uncomfortable. "He was here yesterday too, you know, asking about your daughter, wanting to know details about the accident, about the visits she receives." Edward felt an alarm go off in his mind. "And did you give him that information?" "Of course not." Rebecca seemed offended. "We have strict rules about confidentiality, but he was quite insistent. He said he was conducting an important investigation involving minors. Edward pocketed the card, his mind working rapidly. Something very strange was happening, and somehow Albert Foster was at the center of it. "Thank you for telling me, Rebecca. I'll step out while you take care of Lily. I need to make some calls." In the corridor, Edward called his lawyer, John Parker, a man he had known for years and trusted completely. "John, I need you to investigate someone for me urgently. Albert Foster, Administrative Director of the New Dawn Institute. I want to know everything. Background, finances, any lawsuits or complaints involving him or the Institute." "Sounds serious, Edward," John commented. "Does it have to do with Lily?" "Yes, but it's too complicated to explain over the phone. I also need you to check the records of a boy named David who was at the shelter. I want to know if he was really transferred, and if so, where. Consider it done. I have contacts at the district attorney's office who can help. I'll call you as soon as I have something concrete." Edward hung up, feeling a bit more in control of the situation. While waiting for Rebecca to finish with Lily, he headed to the hospital cafeteria. He needed caffeine and time to organize his thoughts. It was while waiting for his coffee that he noticed, from the corner of his eye, a familiar figure crossing the main lobby. David. The boy walked with his usual calm, the flute secure in his hands, ignored by everyone around him. Edward abandoned his coffee and followed the boy, determined to get answers. This time he wouldn't lose sight of him. David went up the stairs instead of using the elevator, and Edward followed him, keeping his distance. To his surprise, the boy didn't head to Lily's room, but to the hospital chapel, a small, quiet space, on the 3rd floor. The chapel was empty at that hour. David sat in one of the front pews with his back to the entrance. Edward approached, silently, and sat beside him. "I need to understand what's happening," Edward said without beating around the bush. "Your grandmother told me you passed away 2 years ago. The shelter director says you were transferred. But you're here, playing for my daughter every day. Who are you really, David?" The boy remained silent for a long moment, his fingers gently caressing the wooden flute. When he finally spoke, his voice seemed more mature, deeper than Edward remembered. "Some people get trapped between worlds," he said, looking at the small cross on the altar. "To neither here nor there, they need a bridge to find the way." "Are you dead?" The word came out with difficulty from Edward's mouth. David smiled slightly. "People always want clear labels, alive or dead, here or there. The truth is there are more spaces between those places than we imagine. And my daughter, is Lily in those spaces between worlds?" The boy nodded. "The accident left her lost. She wants to return, but doesn't know how to find the way. Music creates the bridge." "And, Cecilia, did my wife know this? About you, about the flute?" "Mrs. Cecilia understood," David replied simply. "She came from a lineage of people who always knew that music is more than just sounds. It's a language that crosses all barriers." Edward tried to process all of that. It seemed like madness, totally contrary to everything he had always believed. However, the rational businessman he had always been was being forced to consider possibilities he would have previously dismissed without hesitation. "Why is Albert so interested in you? Why lie about your transfer?" David's expression darkened. "He knows about the power of music. It's not the first time the flute awakens someone, but he wants the flute for himself, for purposes that aren't healing." "How did he discover about the flute?" "He's been looking for it for a long time. When Mrs. Cecilia took it to the shelter, he felt its presence. That's why he started working there, to find it." A nurse entered the chapel, interrupting the conversation. She looked directly at Edward, showing no sign of seeing David. "Mr. Anderson? Your daughter is asking for you." Edward froze. "What do you mean, asking for me? She moved her lips, sir. Lip reading suggests she said Daddy. Dr. Carter is already in the room. You'd better come quickly." Edward turned to David, but the seat beside him was empty. The boy had disappeared again. Running back to Lily's room, Edward found a small crowd of doctors and nurses around the bed. Dr. Carter was performing a series of tests, his expression a mixture of surprise and contained hope. "What happened?" Edward asked, approaching anxiously. "She's responding, Mr. Anderson," said the doctor, not hiding the admiration in his voice. "Not just reflexes, but voluntary responses to stimuli. It's as if something had unblocked her brain." Edward looked at his daughter and, for the first time in weeks, saw her eyes move deliberately in his direction. They weren't completely open, but there was intention there, consciousness. On the bedside table, where it hadn't been before, rested David's wooden flute. The news that Lily was responding to stimuli spread quickly through the hospital. Nurses, who weren't on duty, appeared to witness what they were already calling the miracle of room 307. Dr. Carter, usually so restrained, couldn't hide his enthusiasm as he explained to Edward that Lily's brain was showing activity patterns typical of an emerging consciousness. "It's as if a barrier had been broken," he explained, reviewing the results of the most recent tests. "I've never seen anything like it in my entire career. Usually patients in deep coma take months, sometimes years, to show this type of response when they do." Edward listened to everything with a mixture of joy and apprehension. His gaze kept drifting to the wooden flute, now resting on the bedside table. No one had commented on it, as if the object were invisible to everyone except him. When he was finally alone with Lily, Edward picked up the flute, examining it carefully. It seemed extremely old, with carvings worn by time that formed subtle patterns along its surface. Bringing it close to his face, he felt a light scent of damp earth and something else, something he couldn't identify, but that vaguely reminded him of the perfume Cecilia used. The door opened softly, and Edward quickly hid the flute under the blanket. Rebecca entered, bringing a tray with coffee and toast. "I thought you might need to eat something," she said with a smile. "I brought your favorite from the cafeteria." "Thank you, Rebecca," Edward replied, genuinely touched by the kindness. "And thank you for everything you've done for Lily. I know it goes beyond your professional duties." The nurse placed the tray on the small table and adjusted Lily's pillow with maternal care. "You know, Mr. Anderson, I've worked at this hospital for 23 years. I've seen many difficult cases, situations that doctors considered lost, but I've always believed there's something beyond medicine that influences recovery." Edward observed her, noticing for the first time the marks of experience on her gentle face. "Do you believe in miracles, Rebecca?" "Let's say I believe there are forces that science still can't completely explain," she replied, with an enigmatic smile. "And I believe love is the most powerful of them. A father's love, for example, who refuses to give up on his daughter." As she organized Lily's medications, Edward noticed a small flute-shaped pendant hanging on a thin chain around her neck. "Beautiful necklace," he commented, feeling a shiver of recognition. Rebecca touched the pendant instinctively. "Oh, this? It was a gift from my grandmother. She said it belonged to the family for generations, a kind of protective amulet." The nurse smiled, a bit embarrassed. "Old people's nonsense, but I never take it off." When Rebecca left, Edward was contemplating the closed door, his mind trying to process yet another coincidence. First David's flute, then Cecilia's notes, now Rebecca's pendant. Everything seemed connected by an invisible thread he was only beginning to perceive. The morning advanced with a succession of doctors and specialists coming to examine Lily. Edward watched everything with growing impatience, anxious to be alone again with his daughter and the mysterious flute. Finally, in the early afternoon, the room emptied. Edward locked the door, something he had never done before, and retrieved the flute from its hiding place. He sat beside Lily's bed and, without knowing exactly why, brought the instrument to his lips. He had never played flute in his life. He expected only a sharp and off-key sound to come from the instrument. Instead, to his amazement, a clear and perfect note filled the room. And then another and another, forming a melody he had never consciously heard. But that seemed familiar, as if it were asleep in some corner of his memory. The monitors connected to Lily began registering changes. Her heart rate increased slightly, and the brain activity sensors showed significant spikes. Edward continued playing, guided by something he couldn't explain, his hands moving over the instrument as if they had a life of their own. It was when he noticed Lily's eyes were completely open, fixed on him. Edward stopped playing abruptly, almost dropping the flute. "Lily," he whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. The girl didn't respond verbally, but her eyes followed him, conscious, present. A tear rolled down the corner of her right eye. "My God, you're here!" Edward took his daughter's hand, feeling a light pressure in response. "You're coming back to me, Princess." A soft sound escaped from Lily's lips. It wasn't a formed word, more a prolonged sigh, but there was intention there. Edward pressed the emergency button, calling the medical team. The rest of the day was a confusion of tests, examinations, and amazed expressions from the medical staff. Dr. Carter spoke of exceptional recovery and a case for scientific publication. Edward just agreed mechanically, his gaze rarely leaving his daughter's face, which now showed unmistakable signs of consciousness, although she still couldn't speak or move completely. It was already night when Edward finally got a moment of privacy with Lily. The girl had fallen into a natural sleep, not the deep coma of the previous weeks, but normal restorative sleep, with small movements and expressions that Edward observed as if they were the most precious spectacle in the world. His phone vibrated. It was John, his lawyer. "Edward, I have information about Albert Foster," he said, without preambles. "And it's not good." "I'm listening," Edward replied, lowering the volume and approaching the window so as not to disturb Lily's sleep. "The New Dawn Institute has only existed for 3 years. Before that, it was another institution called Children's Haven, which closed after complaints of mistreatment and fund misappropriation. Albert was an administrative employee there, but he wasn't formally accused when the case came to light. He took control after the scandal? Exactly. He changed the name, reformed the administration, but many of the old employees remained. There are records of at least 5 anonymous complaints in the last 2 years, all filed for lack of concrete evidence. Edward felt a knot in his stomach. And about David? "Here's the strangest part," John continued. "I found records of a boy named David Silver in the files of the old Children's Haven. He was admitted after losing his parents in a boating accident on Charleston Harbor, but there's no record of transfer to another institution. In fact, according to official documents, he should still be at the New Dawn Institute. And he's not? Well, according to the social worker I spoke with, there's no David at the institute currently. She was quite confused when I mentioned the name, said she would need to check the old files. And here's the most disturbing detail. When I tried to access David's complete file in the system, I discovered it had been recently modified. And guess by whom? Albert Foster, Edward replied, feeling anger grow within him. Exactly. He personally altered the records less than a week ago. And there's more. I got access to the hospital security cameras through a contact. Albert has been there almost every day for the last 2 weeks, mainly in the afternoon period. Edward looked at the flute resting on the bedside table. He's looking for something, John. Something related to a boy who, according to his grandmother, passed away 2 years ago, but who continues appearing and disappearing mysteriously. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. Edward, I know you're going through an extremely difficult time. The accident, Cecilia, Lily, maybe you should consider the possibility that I'm imagining things? Edward completed, his voice firm. It happens that I'm not. Lily is responding, John. She opened her eyes today, and it all started after this boy appeared and began playing his flute for her. That's incredible, Edward. I'm very happy for Lily. But still, I need to ask, are you sure about this boy? Have other people seen him? Edward hesitated. How to explain that David seemed visible only to him? How to talk about a flute that no one else seemed to notice? And about music that crossed barriers between worlds? Just keep investigating, Albert, he finally replied. I need to understand what he wants and why he's so interested in my daughter. And John, thank you. After hanging up, Edward sat again, beside Lily, observing her peaceful face. Delicately, he brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, a gesture he had repeated thousands of times throughout the girl's 7 years of life. Everything will be fine, Princess, he whispered. Daddy will protect you. Always. It was at that moment he noticed something under Lily's pillow. Carefully, so as not to wake her, Edward slid his fingers and retrieved a small folded piece of paper. It was a page torn from Cecilia's notebook, which he hadn't even realized was missing. Unfolding the paper carefully, Edward found a note he hadn't seen before. I discovered something extraordinary about the family flute today. Mrs. Sullivan, David's grandmother, told a story that goes back 5 generations. The flute originally belonged to a healer from the interior of North Carolina who used it to call back souls lost between worlds. It was passed to my great-great-grandmother when her youngest son fell into a deep sleep after a violent fever. The doctors had given up, but the flute's music brought him back. The price, however, is always high. The song creates a bridge, but someone needs to cross it in the opposite direction to maintain balance. Edward reread the last passage several times, trying to understand its meaning. Someone needs to cross it in the opposite direction. What did Cecilia mean by that? Before he could reflect more on the matter, his phone vibrated again. It was a text message from an unknown number. I know about the flute. I know what's happening with your daughter. Meet me tomorrow at 10 a.m. at Angel's Cafe near Charleston Harbor. Come alone, don't trust anyone from the hospital. Edward looked at the message for long moments, torn between mistrust and the desperate need for answers. Finally, he responded, with a single word. I'll be there. He put away his phone and returned his attention to the flute. After a moment of hesitation, he brought it to his lips again and began to play softly. The same strange melody flowed naturally, as if it had always been inside him, waiting to be released. While playing, Edward kept his eyes fixed on Lily, observing every small movement of her eyelids, every subtle alteration in her expression. He was so concentrated that he didn't immediately notice the silent presence in the corner of the room. David was there, watching with his serene and ancient eyes. You came, Edward said, lowering the flute. The music called me, the boy replied, approaching the bed. She's finding her way back. Thanks to you, Edward extended the flute to David. This belongs to you. The boy smiled but didn't take the instrument. Not anymore, now it's your responsibility, as it was Mrs. Cecilia's before. I don't understand. What is this flute exactly? Where does its power come from? David sat on the edge of the bed, his eyes fixed on Lily. Some things exist in the world longer than we can imagine. Music is one of them, the first language, the first magic. This flute was carved from a tree that grew over a place where worlds touch. What worlds? Of the living, of the dead, and all the spaces between them, David replied, with the simplicity of someone explaining something obvious. People, like Lily, who suffered sudden trauma, sometimes get lost in those intermediate spaces, neither completely here nor completely there. Music creates a path for them to find their way back. Edward looked at his daughter, feeling a new understanding take shape in his mind. And you? In which world are you? David's smile was both sad and wise. I am the bridge for now, until balance is restored. The balance. Edward remembered Cecilia's note. Someone needs to cross in the opposite direction. Yes, David confirmed. For each soul that returns, one must depart. That's how it works. A chill ran down Edward's spine. Are you saying that, for Lily to wake up completely, someone needs to take her place, David completed. Voluntarily. An act of love and sacrifice. Edward felt the weight of those words, finally understanding Cecilia's plan. She had discovered about the flute's power, about David, about the spaces between worlds, and she had prepared everything, anticipating that one day she might need that knowledge. Cecilia knew, Edward murmured, more to himself than to David. She knew all along. Mrs. Cecilia understood more than most, David agreed. She recognized the song as soon as she heard it for the first time. It was in her blood, as it is in yours. In my blood? Edward frowned, confused. Why do you think you could play the flute without ever having learned? Why do you think the song came naturally? You and Mrs. Cecilia share more than just love for Lily. You share an ancient lineage, a responsibility. Edward had tried to assimilate all of that when a sudden movement caught his attention. Lily had opened her eyes again and was looking directly at David. Her lips moved, forming a word Edward couldn't understand. "She's almost ready," David said, standing up. "But time is running out. He's getting closer and closer." "Albert?" Edward asked, feeling tension grow. "What does he want with the flute?" "Power," David replied simply. He discovered part of the truth years ago when he found old records in the city library. Stories about miraculous cures, about music that could bring the dead back. Since then, he's been looking for the flute, not to heal, but to control. Control what? The passage, the balance. Decide who returns and who departs. David walked to the window, looking at the starry night over Charleston. Imagine having the power to bring any person back in exchange for sending another in their place. It's not difficult to see how someone could use that for personal gain, for extortion, for revenge. Edward felt a knot in his throat. How can I protect Lily? How can I keep the flute away from him? David turned to Edward, his eyes shining with supernatural intensity. Tomorrow, at Charleston Harbor, the person who sent the message has answers you need. But be careful, Edward. Not everything is what it seems. Not everyone is who they say they are. Before Edward could ask more questions, David walked toward the door. "I'll continue protecting Lily as long as I can, but my time here is limited. Soon, balance will have to be restored." With those words, the boy left, leaving Edward alone with his daughter, the magical flute, and a whirlwind of unanswered questions. Outside, the full moon illuminated Charleston Harbor, casting a silver path over the waters. Somewhere in the city, Albert Foster was plotting his own plans, while time ran inexorably for everyone involved in that strange dance between worlds. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Tell us what city you're watching from. Let's continue. The morning was born grey over Charleston, with a fine mist covering the harbor like an ethereal veil. Edward drove slowly along Highway 17, his mind divided between anxiety about the mysterious meeting and worry about Lily. Leaving the hospital, even for a few hours, had been a difficult decision, but the promise of answers was too strong to ignore. Before leaving, Edward had left the flute under Rebecca's care, the only person at the hospital he felt he could fully trust. The nurse asked no questions when he handed her the instrument, asking only that she keep it close to her body and not show it to anyone. "I have the feeling I've seen this flute before," she had commented, caressing the worn carvings with her fingertips, like a memory from a dream. "Take good care of it," Edward had asked, "and more importantly, take care of Lily. Don't let anyone enter the room besides the regular medical team, especially a man named Albert Foster." Rebecca had nodded seriously. "You can count on it, Mr. Henderson. No one will get near your daughter without my knowing." Now parking his car near Angel's Cafe, Edward checked the message on his cell phone again. 10 a.m. He was a few minutes early, which gave him time to choose a strategically positioned table from where he could observe both the entrance and the movement on the harbor waterfront. The cafe was partially empty at that hour. Some tourists defied the morning mist to walk along the waterfront, while local residents carried out their routine with the tranquility typical of a city that lives at nature's pace. Edward ordered an espresso, more out of habit than desire, his eyes constantly scanning the environment looking for someone who could be his mysterious contact. At exactly 10 a.m., a woman entered the cafe. She appeared to be about 60 years old, with graying hair pulled back in a simple bun, discreet and well cared for clothes. Her eyes, of a deep and penetrating blue, found Edward's immediately, as if she knew exactly who he was and where he would. "Saitis." Without hesitation, she walked to his table and sat down, placing a small patterned fabric bag on the wooden surface. "Edward Anderson," she said, her voice surprisingly melodious for someone her age. "Thank you for coming." "Who are you?" Edward asked, carefully studying the woman's face. There was something vaguely familiar in her features, something he couldn't precisely identify. "My name is Helen Garrett," she replied. Was Cecilia's second cousin." Edward frowned, trying to remember if Cecilia had ever mentioned that name. "Cecilia never talked about you." A sad smile crossed Helen's face. We wouldn't talk. Our family has secrets, traditions that pass only through certain lineages. Cecilia was a guardian as I was, as my mother was before me. Guardian? Edward felt a shiver run down his spine. Guardian of what? Helen looked around, making sure no one was close enough to hear. Of music, Edward, of the flute, of knowledge about the spaces between worlds. Edward felt his heart accelerate. That woman knew. She knew about everything that was happening, about David, about the mysterious flute. How can I be sure you are who you say you are? He asked, still cautious. How can I trust you? Helen opened her bag and retrieved a small leather-bound book with a worn cover. This is my grandmother's diary, Mary Louise Garrett. She was the sister of Cecilia's great-grandmother. Inside it, there are records going back more than 100 years, documenting the flute's history and its passage through our family. She opened the book to a specific page and turned it toward Edward. There was a hand-drawn illustration of the same flute now resting under Rebecca's care, with the same carvings, the same mysterious patterns. Next to the illustration, there was a note in elegant handwriting. The passage flute, guardian of the portals between worlds. My God, Edward murmured, touching the page with trembling fingers. So it's all true. The worlds, the music, the bridge? Yes, Helen confirmed. Our family has been guardian of this knowledge for generations. The flute is just an instrument, Edward, but a powerful instrument, carved from a tree that grew at the exact point where the energies of worlds meet. In the right hands, it's a tool of healing, of rescue for lost souls like your daughter. In the wrong hands, Albert Foster, Edward completed. He's after the flute. Helen nodded, her face hardening. Albert discovered fragments of the story. Years ago, while researching local legends for a book he never published, he became obsessed, believing the flute could give him power over life and death. But he doesn't understand the balance, the price that must be paid. The sacrifice, Edward murmured, remembering David's words. For each soul that returns, one must depart. Exactly, said Helen. It's the fundamental law of passage. It cannot be violated, cannot be circumvented. It's what maintains the balance between worlds. Cecilia knew this. She understood the flute's power, but also respected its limits, its rules. Edward leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Helen's. Are you telling me that Cecilia planned all this, that she knew what would happen? Helen sighed deeply. Not in the way you're thinking. Cecilia couldn't foresee the accident, of course, but she always knew that if something happened to Lily, the flute would be the last hope. That's why she approached the shelter, David. She felt something special in him from the first meeting. David told me he's dead, Edward said, lowering his voice. That his grandmother confirmed it. But then how can he be at the hospital playing for Lily every day? David isn't exactly dead, nor exactly alive, Helen explained. He's at the threshold, at the border between worlds. A temporary guardian, as Cecilia was, as I am now. But his permanence in that state is limited. Soon balance will have to be restored. This means that for Lily to wake up completely, someone needs to take his place, Edward asked, feeling an enormous weight in his chest. Helen nodded slowly. It's the law of passage, Edward. It cannot be violated. For Lily to return completely, a soul must cross in the opposite direction. Edward remained silent for a long moment, absorbing the weight of that revelation. Finally, he raised his eyes, determination written in every line of his face. I'll do it. I'll take her place. Helen touched his hand gently. It's not that simple, Edward. The sacrifice must be made through music, through the flute, and only someone who has the gift can perform the passage. I played the flute yesterday, Edward said urgently. The music came naturally, as if it had always been inside me. David said it's in my blood, as it was in Cecilia's. Helen's expression changed to one of surprise and then understanding. So Cecilia was right. She always suspected you also carried the gift, even without knowing. It's rare, Edward, extremely rare, for two guardian lineages to meet. Perhaps it wasn't coincidence. What should I do? Edward asked, feeling He was finally close to understanding his role in that extraordinary story. How do I save my daughter? Helen reopened the book, flipping until she found another page. The complete song is here. It's ancient, older than any language we know. But the sounds, the notes, they speak directly to the soul. You need to learn the entire melody, Edward. And then at the right moment, when the barrier between worlds is thinnest, you'll need to make your choice. While Helen explained the ritual details, Edward felt a strange relief spread through his body. For the first time since the accident, he saw a clear path ahead of him. A painful path, perhaps, but one he was willing to follow without hesitation, if it meant Lily could live. There's one more thing you need to know, Helen said, closing the book. Albert isn't alone in his search. He has an accomplice inside the hospital, someone who has been keeping him informed about Lily, about you, about the flute. Edward felt his blood freeze. Who? I'm not certain, Helen admitted, but be careful. Trust only those your heart tells you are worthy of trust. While Edward absorbed this disturbing information, his phone rang. It was Rebecca. Mr. Anderson. Her voice was tense, urgent. You need to come back immediately. There was an attempt to enter Lily's room, a man claiming to be from Child Protective Services, wanting to do an inspection. When I asked for official documentation, he became aggressive. Security escorted him out, but I'm sure he'll be back. I'm on my way, Edward replied, already standing up. Don't let anyone in, Rebecca, no one. Hanging up, he looked at Helen. Albert is making his move. I need to get back to the hospital. Helen nodded, handing him the ancient book. Take this, study the song. You'll know when it's the right time to use it, and Edward, she held his arm, her eyes intense. Remember, music is just the vehicle. It's love, voluntary sacrifice that really opens the passage. Edward stored the book and hurriedly left the cafe, heading to the parking lot. While starting the car, he noticed through the rearview mirror a familiar figure watching him from the opposite sidewalk. Albert Foster, wearing dark glasses and a hat that couldn't completely disguise his identity, was talking on the phone while observing him. The drive back to the hospital was tense, with Edward constantly checking if he was being followed. His mind worked frantically, trying to identify who could be Albert's informant inside the hospital. Some doctor, a nurse, an administrative employee? Upon arriving, he found unusual movement at the reception. 2 security guards were talking, with a woman in a suit whom Edward recognized as the hospital's administrative director. What happened? He asked, approaching the group. Mr. Anderson, the director turned to him, clearly uncomfortable. There was an incident earlier. A man tried to access your daughter's room using false Child Protective Services credentials. When confronted, he became aggressive. Nurse Rebecca Cruz identified him and alerted security. Where is she? Where's Rebecca? Edward asked, looking around. In the 3rd floor restroom. She was quite shaken by the incident. Edward thanked quickly and headed to the elevators. While waiting, his cell phone vibrated with a message from John. More information about Albert. He was investigated 5 years ago for involvement with a sect in North Carolina that practiced rituals using music to supposedly communicate with the dead. Nothing was proven, but he lost his job at the university where he taught cultural anthropology. Be careful, Edward. This man seems dangerously obsessed. Reaching the 3rd floor, Edward found Rebecca sitting alone in the restroom, an untouched glass of water in front of her. Upon seeing him, she immediately stood up. Thank God you arrived, she said, visibly relieved. He was very insistent, said he had orders to evaluate Lily's psychological well-being. When I refused to let him in, he threatened to come back with a court order. You did exactly the right thing, Rebecca. Edward gently squeezed her shoulder. The flute! Do you still have it? Rebecca nodded, discreetly opening her uniform pocket to show the tip of the instrument. I haven't let it out of my sight for a second, as you asked. And Lily? She's fine. Dr. Carter came by half an hour ago. She's becoming more and more responsive. She managed to hold a pencil today, Edward. A pencil. Rebecca's eyes shone with contained tears. It's as if with each passing hour she comes back a little more. Edward felt a wave of relief and hope. I need to see her. As they walked down the corridor toward Lily's room, Edward noticed Rebecca seemed nervous, constantly looking back as if she feared being followed. "Is there something else you haven't told me?" he asked, lowering his voice. Rebecca hesitated, then spoke quickly. "Before Albert showed up, I received a strange call. Her distorted voice saying it knew about the flute, that I should hand it over or face the consequences. I thought it was some prank, but then, minutes later, he appeared." Edward felt a chill. "Do you think there's someone inside the hospital informing Albert?" "I'm almost certain," Rebecca replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Strange things have been happening. Files out of place, unknown people circulating in restricted areas, and yesterday I saw Dr. Thompson, one of the residents, going through your coat when you briefly left the room. He seemed scared when he noticed I was watching him." Edward's mind worked rapidly. Dr. Thompson, the young resident who occasionally accompanied Dr. Carter on visits. Always quiet, always observing, making notes that seemed excessively detailed. Reaching Lily's room, Edward found his daughter awake, her eyes following him with clarity as he approached the bed. There was a brightness of recognition there, an awareness that grew with each hour. "Hi, Princess," he said, kissing her forehead. "Daddy's back." To his surprise and emotion, Lily slightly moved her lips, forming what seemed to be a faint smile. It was the first smile since the accident, and Edward felt warm tears streaming down his face. "She's coming back," Rebecca murmured, also emotional. "It's a miracle, Edward, a true miracle." But Edward knew it wasn't a miracle. It was the music, the flute, the bridge between worlds that David had created with his ancestral melodies. And now, with Helen's book, he finally understood what needed to be done to complete the process. "Rebecca," he said, drying his tears, "I need you to stay with Lily for a few more hours. There's something I need to do, something important for her recovery." The nurse nodded without asking questions. "I'll be here, Edward, don't worry." As Edward prepared to leave, the room door opened. Dr. Carter entered, followed by young Dr. Thompson, who carried a clipboard and avoided looking directly at Edward. "Mr. Anderson, good to find you," said Dr. Carter, smiling. "We were just discussing Lily's extraordinary case. The results of the latest tests are surprising. Brain activity is almost normalized, and motor reflexes are returning at a pace that, frankly, I've never seen in my entire career." Edward carefully observed Dr. Thompson, noticing how the young doctor seemed uncomfortable, his eyes constantly drifting to Rebecca's hand, where the nurse discreetly kept the flute in her pocket. "It's truly remarkable recovery," Edward agreed, not taking his eyes off the resident. "Almost magical, wouldn't you say, Dr. Thompson?" The young doctor, startled at being directly addressed. Yes, extraordinary," he stammered. I'm documenting everything for a possible case study." "Of course you are," Edward replied, his tone deliberately neutral. "I imagine many people would be interested in a case like this." A tense silence hung in the air for a few seconds until Dr. Carter, apparently oblivious to the underlying tension, continued with his optimistic medical report. Edward listened with one ear, while his mind worked on the next step. He needed to confirm his suspicions about Dr. Thompson, understand the extent of his involvement with Albert, and most importantly, he needed to prepare for the ritual that would finally bring Lily back. Outside the hospital, dark clouds were beginning to form on the horizon. A summer storm was approaching Charleston, bringing with it strong winds and the promise of transformation. In a few hours, according to weather forecasts, it would be the most intense storm of the season. Somewhere between worlds, David waited, his own existence becoming increasingly tenuous as Lily found her way back. Balance needed to be restored, one soul for another, one passage in exchange for another. And in Edward's mind, a decision had already been made. For Lily, for his daughter, he would make any sacrifice, even if it meant crossing the bridge of no return, to a world from which there would be no coming back. The storm arrived in Charleston with a fury rarely seen, even by the standards of the island's summer tempests. Lightning cut through the sky at increasingly shorter intervals, followed by thunder that made the hospital windows vibrate. The electrical power fluctuated, forcing the emergency system into action repeatedly. Edward watched the storm from Lily's room window, feeling there was a strange synchrony between the fury of the elements outside and the crucial moment approaching. He had spent the last few hours meticulously studying Helen's book, memorizing each note of the ancient song, each detail of the ritual he would need to perform. Lily slept peacefully, her face now serene, so different from the artificial immobility of the first days of coma. Occasionally her fingers moved slightly, as if she were dreaming, and small sounds escaped from her lips, almost words, almost pieces of sentences. Rebecca had stepped out momentarily to get more cold compresses, leaving Edward alone with his daughter and his thoughts. The flute rested in his hands, the ancient carvings seeming to almost glow under the intermittent light of the lightning. "It will work," said a familiar voice behind him. Edward turned and saw David standing near the door. The boy seemed different, more translucent, less substantial, as if he were slowly fading away. "You're disappearing," Edward observed, feeling a tightness in his chest. David looked at his own hands, which seemed almost transparent under certain light. "It's the balance readjusting. The more Lily returns, the less I can remain on this plane." "I thought you were some kind of guardian," Edward said, approaching the boy, "that you could exist between worlds." "Temporarily," David explained with that ancient wisdom that always disconcerted Edward. "I was called to be the initial bridge, to start the process. But now that Lily is almost completely back, balance needs to be permanently restored." Edward nodded, finally understanding. "And that's why someone needs to take her place, to maintain balance." "Yes," David confirmed, "but it must be a voluntary act, a sacrifice made out of love. Music only opens the way, creates the bridge. It's the intention behind it that really makes the magic happen." "I'm ready," Edward said, his voice firm. "I studied the song, understood the ritual. When the storm reaches its peak, I'll play the complete melody and offer my soul in exchange for Lily's." David looked at him with an expression that mixed admiration and sadness. "You really love her that much?" "She's my daughter," Edward replied simply. "From the moment I held her for the first time, I knew I would do anything for her. Besides," he looked at his daughter's sleeping face, "after losing Cecilia, I can't lose her too. Lily deserves to live her life, grow up, realize her dreams. And if the price for that is my own existence, it's a price I'll pay without hesitation." At that moment, the door opened and Rebecca entered, carrying a tray with compresses. As always happened when other people were present, David became invisible to everyone except Edward. "The storm is getting worse," Rebecca commented, placing the tray on the table. "They say the eye of the storm will pass directly over the island." Around midnight. Edward checked his watch. 10:37 p.m., less than an hour and a half until the perfect moment. "Rebecca," he said, making a sudden decision, "I need to tell you something important. Something that will seem crazy but is absolutely true." The nurse looked at him with curiosity. "What is it, Edward?" In the next few minutes, Edward told everything. About David, about the magical flute, about the spaces between worlds, about the ritual he would need to perform to bring Lily back completely. To his surprise, Rebecca listened to everything without interruptions, her face changing from curiosity to understanding, and finally to serene acceptance. "Do you believe me?" Edward asked when he finished his account. Rebecca touched the small flute-shaped pendant she wore around her neck. "My grandmother used to tell stories about music that could heal, about melodies that crossed worlds. I always thought they were just legends, tales to lull children to sleep. But since Lily started responding after those mysterious music sessions, well, there are things in this world that science still can't explain." Edward felt immense relief at not being alone, at having found an ally who understood or at least accepted the extraordinary strangeness of the situation. "I need your help," he said. "When the storm reaches its peak, I'll need absolute privacy to perform the ritual. No one can interrupt, especially Albert or Dr. Thompson." "You can count on me," Rebecca assured, determined. "I'll stay at the door making sure no one enters, but Edward," she hesitated, her gaze worried, "this sacrifice, are you sure it's the only way?" "Absolute," he replied, without hesitation. "It's my daughter, Rebecca. There's no choice to be made here." The nurse nodded, respecting his decision, although worry still marked her face. As the minutes passed and the storm intensified, Edward sat beside Lily, holding her hand, memorizing every detail of her face, every small freckle, every curve of her eyelashes. He was at peace with his decision. For Lily, any sacrifice was worth it. At 11:45 p.m., Rebecca checked Lily's vital signs one last time and left to assume her sentinel position outside the room. Before leaving, she hugged Edward tightly. "Good luck," she whispered, "and thank you for trusting me." When the door closed, David reappeared, now so translucent that Edward could see the wall through him. "It's almost time," the boy said, his voice sounding distant as if coming from very far away. "The barrier between worlds will be thinnest exactly at midnight, when the eye of the storm passes over the hospital." Edward positioned himself beside Lily's bed, the flute in his hands, the ancient book open to the page of the ritual song. "What will happen exactly? How will I know it?" "Worked? You'll know," David replied enigmatically. "When the last note is played, if your intention is pure, the passage will open. Lily will return completely, and you'll follow the opposite path." "Will I be dead?" The word came out with difficulty. "Not exactly," David said. "You'll be in another plane of existence, neither here nor there, as I've been for so long." A particularly loud crash shook the building, and the lights flickered several times before stabilizing again. Edward consulted his watch. 11:55 p.m. 5 minutes. To midnight. It was at that moment they heard altered voices in the corridor. Rebecca's voice, firm but tense, and a masculine voice, insistent and aggressive. "You can't enter now, Mr. Foster. The attending physician hasn't authorized visits at this time." "I'm not asking for authorization. I'm demanding it. I know what's happening in there. I know about the flute, about the ritual. He's going to ruin everything." Edward felt a chill. Albert was there, trying to interrupt the ritual. Somehow, he had discovered about the critical moment. "Continue with the plan," David said urgently. "We don't have much time. The nurse will hold him off as much as she can." Edward brought the flute to his lips, his heart beating hard against his chest. The ancient melody began to flow, ancestral notes filling the room with an almost palpable presence. It was as if each sound created visible waves in the air, colors and textures that transcended normal perception. As he played, Edward kept his eyes fixed on Lily, observing every small reaction. Her fingers began to move more deliberately, her eyelids trembling with more intensity. The storm outside seemed to synchronize with the music, each note finding echo in the thunder, each pause underlined by the wind's howl. The voices in the tour corridor grew louder, more urgent, but Edward continued playing, lost in the melody that seemed to come not just from the flute, but from some deep place within him. When the clock struck exactly midnight, something extraordinary happened. A particularly intense lightning illuminated the room, followed by absolute silence. The eye of the storm had arrived. And in that moment of supernatural calm, Edward played the final sequence of the ritual melody, each note loaded with his love for Lily, with his absolute willingness to sacrifice. The last note vibrated in the air for an impossible time, expanding, transforming into something more than sound. Edward felt as if the entire room was dissolving around him, the walls becoming translucent, revealing an infinite space beyond them, full of lights and shadows moving in hypnotizing patterns. And then he saw translucent figures, human forms that seemed made of light and memory. Among them he immediately recognized Cecilia, as beautiful as he remembered, smiling at him with infinite love and gratitude. "Cecilia," he whispered, the flute still at his lips. She approached, not walking, but floating through that intermediate space. When she came close enough, Edward could see that tears of light were streaming down her ethereal face. "My love," her voice was like music, vibrating in frequencies that transcended physical sound. "You found the way. You understood." I'm ready, Edward said, feeling a deep peace spread through his entire being. Ready to take Lily's place so she can live. Cecilia smiled, but there was sadness in her luminous eyes. Oh, Edward, always so willing to sacrifice. That's why I always loved you so much. At that moment, the room door was violently opened. Albert Foster burst in, followed by Dr. Thompson. Rebecca tried to stop them but was pushed aside. "Stop!" Albert shouted, advancing toward Edward. "You don't know what you're doing. The flute belongs to me. The power of passage is mine by right." But Albert froze halfway, his eyes widening in absolute shock, for he too could see the luminous figures, the intermediate space that had revealed itself. He could see Cecilia, David, and all the other souls that inhabited that plane between worlds. It's real," he babbled, his face a mask of greed and fascination. "Everything is real. The power, control over life and death." "You never understood," David said, materializing completely for the first time, his form now solid and luminous. "It's not about power or control, it's about balance, harmony, love." In the bed, Lily opened her eyes completely for the first time, blinking confused at the extraordinary scene before her. "Daddy?" Her voice was weak, but perfectly audible. "What's happening? Who are these people?" Edward felt his heart almost explode with joy at hearing his daughter's voice again. "I'm here, Princess," he said, tears streaming freely down his face. "Everything will be fine now." Albert advanced again, his eyes fixed on the flute. "Give me that," he demanded, extending his hand. "You have no idea of the power you're holding, of what can be done with it." "I know exactly what I'm holding," Edward replied calmly, "and I know exactly what I'm willing to sacrifice out of love." At that moment, Cecilia approached Lily, her luminous form hovering over the bed. "My little one," she whispered, in a voice that only Lily seemed to hear completely. "Mommy is here. Mommy has always been here." Lily extended her hand, her fingers almost touching Cecilia's ethereal form. "Mommy," she whispered, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. "I found you in the dreams. You sang to me." "Yes, my love," Cecilia confirmed. "I was guiding you back, and now you've returned. Completely." Edward knew what he needed to do. He brought the flute to his lips one last time, preparing to play. The final note, the note that would seal his fate, that would complete the exchange. But before he could do so, Albert advanced with a cry of rage, trying to snatch the flute from his hands. In the confusion, Dr. Thompson, who until then had watched the scene paralyzed, also moved, trying to contain his accomplice. "Stop, Albert!" Thompson shouted. "This has gone too far. You said it was just research, that we wanted to understand the phenomenon, not this." The two men struggled, and Edward tried to protect the flute, knowing instinctively that if it broke, the passage could close catastrophically with unpredictable consequences. It was at that moment of chaos that David stepped forward, his form now completely solid, real. "Enough," he said, his voice carrying an authority that paralyzed everyone in the room. "Balance will be restored. The passage will be completed." With a quick movement, David took the flute from Edward's hands and brought it to his own lips. The melody that emerged was different from everything Edward had ever heard. Deeper, more ancient, as if it came from the very fabric of reality. "No!" Edward shouted, suddenly understanding the boy's intention. "David, don't do this. The sacrifice is mine to make." But it was too late. David's last note vibrated in the air, expanding in concentric waves of light and sound. Albert, who had managed to break free from Thompson, launched himself toward the boy with a desperate cry. It was his fatal error. Upon contact with the pure energy waves emanating from the flute, Albert was enveloped by intense light, his body becoming translucent, then transparent, until finally disappearing completely. "Balance demands a soul," David said, lowering the flute. "But it doesn't need to be a pure soul. A soul corrupted by greed, by desire for power, also serves the purpose." Edward looked at the empty space where Albert had been seconds before, then at David, then at Cecilia, who smiled with a mixture of sadness and acceptance. "He chose his path," Cecilia said softly, "just as we all choose ours." Slowly, the luminous figures began to disappear, the intermediate space gradually closing. Cecilia approached Edward one last time, her form already beginning to fade. "Take care of our daughter," she whispered. "Live, Edward, live for all of us." And then she was gone, along with all the other souls, the room returning to its normal solidity, the walls again. Opaque, ordinary reality reassuming its dominion. In the corridor, hurried footsteps announced the arrival of more people, probably security guards, alerted by the commotion. Dr. Thompson remained leaning against the wall in a state of shock, unable to process what he had just witnessed. David was still there, solid, real, the flute in his hands. But something had changed in him. His eyes, once loaded with ancient wisdom, now seemed normal, the eyes of a common 10-year-old boy. What happened?" he asked, looking confused around. "Where am I?" Edward understood then. The David he had known, the guardian between worlds, had completed his mission. In his place was just a boy, the same boy but without the memories, without the expanded consciousness that had guided him until then. "You're safe," Edward replied gently, approaching him. "And you did something very brave, even if you don't remember." In the bed, Lily moved, trying to sit up. "Daddy," she called, her voice stronger now. "Who is this boy?" Edward helped his daughter get comfortable, his heart overflowing with joy at seeing the full consciousness in her eyes, the deliberate movement of her limbs. She had returned completely. "This is David," Edward introduced, "a very special friend, someone who helped bring you back to me." Lily observed the boy with curiosity. "He has a pretty flute," she commented, "like the one in the drawing Mommy made for me." Edward felt tears in his eyes again. Lily remembered. She remembered Cecilia, the drawings, life before the accident. She was truly back. Rebecca entered the room, followed by 2 security guards and Dr. Carter, who had been called as an emergency. Everyone stopped, surprised to see Lily sitting in bed, talking normally. "My God," exclaimed Dr. Carter, quickly approaching to examine her. This is extraordinary." While the doctor performed quick tests, amazed at Lily's complete and inexplicable recovery, Edward exchanged a meaningful look with Rebecca. Both knew the truth about what had happened, a truth that would remain as their shared secret. "And Dr. Thompson?" Rebecca asked Edward discreetly. "And Albert?" "Thompson was just a manipulated pawn," Edward replied, observing the young doctor still in shock. "As for Albert, he found exactly what he was looking for, just not in the way he expected." When the security guards asked about the commotion, about the screams they had heard, Edward explained that Albert had tried to invade the room, but fled when security was called. It was a simple but necessary lie. Some truths are too heavy to be shared. In the following hours, the hospital transformed into a whirlwind of activity. Specialist doctors were called to document Lily's miraculous recovery. Tests were performed, showing a perfectly functional brain, without any apparent sequelae from the trauma that had nearly taken her. As for David, Edward made a decision he knew was right. Using his contacts and resources, he initiated the process to become the boy's legal guardian. After all, as he explained to Lily, who immediately supported the idea with childish enthusiasm, they owed him a lot, more than they could ever express. 3 months later, the Anderson mansion on the harbor front was unrecognizable. Where before there had been only Edward's heavy silence, now echoed the laughter of Lily and David, who had become inseparable, like siblings who had always known each other. The ancient flute rested in a glass case in the music room, a silent reminder of the power of love, sacrifice, and music that can cross worlds. Edward rarely played it now, but sometimes, on stormy nights, he could swear he heard its notes echoing softly through the house, as if played by invisible hands. And in especially quiet moments, when the evening light bathed the living room, in golden tones, both Lily and David occasionally stopped what they were doing, looked at an empty point in the environment and smiled, as if they saw something, or someone, that no one else could see. Edward knew. Cecilia was still there, somehow. Not trapped between worlds, but free to visit, to observe, to love beyond the barriers of physical existence. Music had created that possibility, that eternal connection that not even death could completely break. On a particularly beautiful afternoon, while watching the children play in the garden, Edward felt a familiar presence beside him. He didn't need to turn to know who it was. "Thank you," he whispered to the air. "For everything." A gentle breeze caressed his face like an ethereal kiss, and Edward smiled at peace with the past, present in the current moment, and hopeful about the future unfolding.